So the main idea of this series, the main idea that we introduced last week, is that when we ignore the relationship between our emotional maturity and spiritual maturity, both our emotional life and our spiritual life suffer. They both suffer. I quoted Pete Scazzero's book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, last week, and he says this: "It is not possible for a Christian to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature." And I think that's why we can see a disconnect between our internal life and our external life. We can see a disconnect of saying like, no, but like I love Jesus. Like I want to live my life. My strongest desire is to follow Jesus. But then I have these other desires, these other strong desires that lead me to live in ways and think in ways and feel in ways that don't align with what I know to be true. And we want to try to connect those two things over the course of the next several weeks as we go through this. So today, we're going to do another kind of theoretical ground laying, kind of like lay some groundwork sermon. The rest of the series is going to be far more kind of theological and practical. But today we really want to look at how do we hear our emotions well. Last week I introduced you to a helpful concept of seeing emotions not just as feelings or things that influence our thoughts, but that emotions speak. Emotions say something. Emotions are kind of the mother tongue of our heart. Our emotions say something all the time, whether they're positive or negative, whether they're good emotions or bad emotions. They're always saying something. So our job is to hear what they're saying, kind of examine what they're saying, evaluate what they're saying, and then respond correctly, right? So today we want to look at how do we actually hear our emotions. Experts, smart people that study emotions and cognitive science and all that, identify 8 families of emotions. Okay, 8 kind of groupings of emotions. Now, there's a lot kind of packed into this, but really, when you take all of the emotions that you and I experience across our life, they can kind of be boiled down and distilled into 8 main groups. The first is anger, and that would include things like irritability or annoyance. Anyone? Yeah, all right. Okay, anger. Secondly would be sadness. And this would be also circumstantial things like grief and despair or loneliness. The third category is fear. This would include things like anxiety, nervousness, or even apprehension. Also joy or enjoyment. That would include things like contentment and delight. Love. That would include things like acceptance and trust and relationships. Surprise. Some of you love surprises. I do not. It makes me feel very insecure. Just being honest, just confessing with you. Don't surprise me, please. But that involves shock or amazement or just kind of being in awe of something. Second to last, disgust. That would be anything that you kind of have an averse reaction to or a hate towards or a revulsion of some kind. And last would be shame. And of course, that includes things, especially with our past. As we look back, we have remorse or regret or guilt. Now, the reason why I show you this is because on a day-to-day, it's so important to be able to understand what we're feeling and hear what we're feeling before we know what to do with what we're feeling. Are you with me on that? Yeah, there you go. It's super deep and profound. You're welcome. That one's for free. Okay? But we need to be able to kind of read the dashboard of our emotional life. We need to know what is even going on in us before we know how to respond. Does this emotion need to be quieted and silenced, or does it need to be amplified? But before we even decide what to do with emotions, we need to know what our emotions are and what they're saying. And last week we got to see, I kind of challenged you and asked how you pictured Jesus. If you're a follower of Jesus and have been around the church for a while, you may have had kind of a picture of white, blue-eyed, medieval Jesus, very Spock-like, almost floating through the fields, saying really profound things. If you're not a follower of Jesus, you don't care that much. So welcome. Okay, but I asked you, how would you picture Jesus' emotional life? Was he passionate? Was he Spock-like? When things happened, did he just kind of do a downward dog and get zen and just say things like, it doesn't matter if I live or die? Or do we see a different picture biblically about Jesus and how he expresses his emotions? And so I introduced you to this very passionate Jesus. I brought you through kind of just really scattergun spectrum of all of the emotions that Jesus displays in the Gospels alone. And these emotions that we see, Jesus experienced the full spectrum of them. He expressed the full spectrum of them, but he did it perfectly. You and I don't do that perfectly. We experience emotions and they're done imbalanced, or they're done kind of the cocktail of our emotions get just kind of volatile and messed up. We don't understand and hear our emotions well like Jesus did. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't hear our emotions. All day, every day, your emotions and mine say something about you. They say something about what is important to you. Emotions in one way point to something that is valuable, something that we value or hold with some kind of worth or significance. So emotions do say something important. In a very real way, to understand how we feel day to day is to actually understand who we are. It's to understand who we are. And now you are more than your feelings, for sure, but you're not less than your feelings. Emotions and what we feel and how we feel is a key component that makes you and I who we are. And that's not a mistake. God designed us that way. We see throughout Scripture a God who expresses emotions. Intense passion and love and pursuit of people who rebel. But also anger and justice against those who would just ignore his offer of grace and love. We see a God who is expressive in that. And if we're created in God's image, we also are created to express those emotions. So, here's what we're going to lean into. We're going to lean in to this reality that emotions don't just signal to you and I how we feel. Emotions actually point us to what we believe. Emotions point you and I to the dominant story that shapes our life. Now, the most recent neuroscience studies have shown, just without a shadow of a doubt, proven, just looking cognitively in our brain and looking at the neurology of our brain, that we are story-shaped people. That you and I, our life is shaped more by the stories we believe and the stories we live in than any other thing. It's fascinating. They've looked at the human brain compared to other mammals and other animals. And they have shown that the Homo sapiens brain has this enlarged part of our brain for story. Like, we don't even know how not to tell stories. We don't even know how not to filter our daily life through this encompassing kind of macro level story that gives us value. So this isn't a question of religion or non-religion. It's like, well, I'm not religious or I am religious. This is how we're wired to see the world. Every day we tell ourselves stories to make sense of the world and to answer the biggest questions about life. Sometimes this is called a worldview. Everyone, religious or non, has a worldview, meaning it's the lens by which we see the world. And all of us have an answer to questions like, who are we? How did we get here? Why are we here? What's our purpose? What went wrong? What is humanity's problem? What is broken in the world? And how is it going to get fixed? That's a worldview. A worldview helps us answer these key questions, and how we answer those key questions radically changes how we live our life and how we relate to others and ourselves. You see the connection? If I come from nowhere and nothing and I go back to nothing, I'm going to make very different decisions than if I believe that I've put here for a reason, made in the image of God, to glorify God and ultimately spend eternity with God. I'm going to live very differently. That's a worldview. That's a worldview. And I think what emotions do is emotions point us to the stories that kind of underlie everything else that we do and believe. There's a famous experiment that was done in 1944 by two psychologists called Heider and Simmel. And they played this video. I'm going to let it play. I'm going to keep talking over it. There's no audio. Okay, they played this. They had 120 people in the room. It's about a minute long. Just watch this. Some of you have already created a soundtrack for it. Good for you. So they had 120 people in the room, and they asked, "What did you see? Describe what you saw." Now, 3 out of 120 people gave the very rational, logical explanation. "I saw circle and triangles on a blank screen." But 117 of 120 people did what? They told a story. Some of you already feel so passionate about that one triangle. Like some of you already were just like, why is he doing that, right? Now they did this, but what was crazy is that 117 people told a story. Only 3 people gave a very Spock-like, non-emotional, non-story shaped description of what they saw, of what they experienced. But here it was crazy. 117 people told a story, and they were different for every single person who told the story. Every single person had a different perspective and a story about what was actually happening. They gave them names, all sorts of stuff, and just packed this very, very abstract, simple video with so much meaning because it was shaped by story. Why? Why would we do that? Why did you do that? Because narrative and story is stitched into the fabric of who we are. The average Canadian consumes 4 hours of storytelling per day. Whether it's TV or film or social media or video games, the best, most immersive storytelling medium to date. Amen. Books, talking to friends. We are telling stories. You get together with a friend for coffee. What do? You start telling stories. You tell stories about your week. You tell stories about other people. Maybe it's called gossiping. But you tell stories. You don't just sit and abstractly have a very Spock-like conversation. You experience relationship to the world around you, including relationship with others, via the medium of story. Over the course of our life, they've shown that we will actually spend more time in the realm of fantasy storyland than the real world. Some of you hang out there a lot, and your entire world is a fantasy, and you need to wake up. Others of you, you don't go there often, but you're still story-shaped. Everything you do comes from a story that you believe that underlies all the values that you hold. There's a book by a guy called Jonathan Gottschall, The Storytelling Animal, and here's what he says about this. We are addicted to story. Even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories. The storytelling mind is allergic to uncertainty, randomness, and coincidence. It is addicted to meaning. If the storytelling mind cannot find meaningful patterns in the world, it will try to impose them. In short, the storytelling mind is a factory that churns out true stories when it can, but will manufacture lies when it can't. Isn't that wild? That we don't know how not to tell stories. And if our stories aren't connected to the objective truth of reality, then we will actually just make false ones up. We'll tell stories about who we are and what life's for. We'll just make stories up. And then we'll organize our life around those false stories. It's fascinating that we just don't even know how to not tell stories. Now, what does this have to do with our emotions? Well, our emotions flow from the stories that we tell. Emotions say something about the dominant story that kind of is the foundation behind everything that we believe. Pete Scazzaro says it this way. The stories that we tell ourselves have an enormous impact on our feelings. Here's the example. This is amazing. Consider the difference of what goes on in your mind when a friend who agrees to meet you for dinner is 40 minutes late. How different are your feelings when you tell yourself, maybe he had an accident driving here, or this relationship is clearly more important to me than it is to him. Our feelings are closely related to the story we tell ourselves about the things that are going on around us. Isn't it amazing? Sitting there, our friend is 40 minutes late. The story that we tell ourselves will dictate how we feel, how we greet them, what we order or what we don't order, everything. What we talk about, what we don't talk about. Maybe we don't talk and we get up and we storm out and we leave because they don't value me. And it's all from a story that we tell ourselves. All day, every day, we tell ourselves story about our value and our worth, our past, our present, the future. We tell ourselves stories about people's intentions and what people really meant. We tell ourselves stories. And most importantly, the most important story that we tell ourselves is God's view of us, who God is, and what we are and who we are in relationship to God. If you are not religious and your belief is that there is no God, that's still a relationship to God. That's still a story that you embed your life into. If you believe that there is a God and that he is the ultimate good and that there's purpose and value and meaning that comes from him, that we get our worth from him, we're not just kind of self-empowered beings, that changes everything again, and that's a story. Okay, I belabor this so that we see the importance of this framework that's laid for us, that you and I will, whether we like it or not, instinctively think through and live through the lens of story. Stories literally will shape how we live our lives. The kicker in this, for us, looking at emotions, that we also tell ourselves stories about emotions. That's where things get complicated. It's like, wait, our emotions point to the story we believe, but we also tell stories about what emotions are for. We also tell stories about our emotions. I'll give you 2 examples, and we touched on this a bit last week. Number 1, we tell ourselves that our emotions are everything. This is us today in the West. In our cultural moment, emotions determine me. I am defined by how I feel. The highest good in our cultural moment today is for all individuals to equally feel good. So we try to just take the whole social fabric and make sure that it is going to allow for everyone to feel good because we are what we feel. This has led to a phenomenon of authenticity. The Google hits on authenticity and authentic in the last 5 years has gone up by hundreds of millions of hits. Why? Well, because we're trying to understand how we feel and the connection that has between who we are. So what we've done is we've said emotions are everything. You are what you feel, so be authentic. Live your truth. Be who you are. And who we are is what we feel. Every given moment, every given day, we are what we feel. Now, we can't just say that that's a cultural thing. That affects the church too. That affects us right here. We have elevated emotional experiences and made them spiritual. If we don't feel God, God must not be there. We've used emotions as the compass through which we navigate who God is and what God is doing. So the goal of a sermon right now is for you to feel convicted or to feel encouraged. The goal of community or the potluck later is for you to feel full and connected and feel that you belong. The goal of worship and singing is to feel a rush of thanksgiving and gratitude, and maybe I even do this. Do you see how feelings and kind of the idea of emotions being center has actually now driven much of what the Western church has done in our relationship with God? Now, that's one story we tell ourselves. The second story, the first one is emotions are everything. The second story is that emotions are nothing. That spirituality is very stoic, and emotions are liars. Objective truth is how I live my life. If I feel, I silence it because that's not what God's about, right? So we have this spiritual thing where emotions are nothing. So we silence them, we muzzle them, and we exchange them for facts. The church, this affects us. We become suspicious of all emotions, right? We become self-focused. And we don't understand that emotions too can be a way that we do experience who God is. Or we see every negative emotion, and this is important, as a failure of faith. So if I feel this way, I must not be trusting God. If I feel this way, I must not be looking to must not be letting God be sovereign. That's what it is. I feel this way because God is sovereign, right? But that's not what we see biblically about the definition, the balanced definition of emotions at all. So here's what we want to do this morning. We want to try to just take the two extremes of emotions are everything, emotions are nothing, and then we want to locate emotions well and learn how to hear our emotions properly. But we need to understand the story that shapes those emotions. If you and I are story-shaped people, and we will fabricate false stories, how important is it for us to know the true story of reality? And this is the beauty of the gospel. The biblical narrative and the thread across history is that the gospel tells us an alternative story. The gospel tells us the true and better story. A story that confronts every false story that you and I will tell ourselves. It confronts every false story that you and I will concoct in our minds. The gospel comes and objectively says, this is how reality is. The gospel shapes a worldview. The gospel comes and says, I can say. Jesus shows up and says, I can say why we are here, who you are, who I am, what life is about, and where this is headed. The gospel is an alternative story. We just celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day recently. And most experts will show that with Martin Luther King, why the civil rights movement was so effective through him as a mouthpiece wasn't because of his speaking abilities, although they were great. It was because Martin Luther King exposed white America to an alternative story about black African Americans. And it was that story that revolutionized and fueled the civil rights movement. And here we are. Culture changed because of an alternative story. But unless that alternative story that we tell ourselves and tell our culture is rooted in truth and rooted in the real, true perception of reality, it cannot change us for the better. Late philosopher Ivan Illich says this: neither revolution nor reformation can ultimately change a society. Rather, you must tell a new powerful tale. One so persuasive that it sweeps away the old myths and becomes the preferred story. One so inclusive that it gathers all the bits of our past and present into a coherent whole. One that even shines some light into our future so that we can take the next step. If you want to change a society, then you have to tell an alternative story. Our emotions, our relationship to God, our relationship to sexuality, our relationship to money and possessions, our relationship to our past and our future are only going to experience change if we are exposed to the radical alternative story of the gospel. And regarding emotions, what the gospel tells us, what Jesus Christ teaches, is that we need more than new feelings. You and I don't just need new feelings. You and I need a new heart. We don't just need new behaviors. Religion can do that. We need new affections of our heart that lead to new behaviors. We don't need to just have new beliefs as if intellectual assent is how we reach kind of spiritual zenith. Belief is not all that matters. It's about becoming. The gospel comes with an alternative story and says, this is not about what you do, what you believe, and how you feel. It's about who you are. It's about whose your life belongs to. It's about who you belong to. And if our dominant story is that my life belongs to me, to be enjoyed, everything I have belongs to me, my body is mine, my money is mine, my life is mine, I'm just going to kill it for as many years as I have, you and I are going to live very differently than if we're confronted with the gospel reality, but that we are called who we are because of who God is and not because of who we self-actualize ourselves to be. So listen, because we don't just need new feelings, we need a new heart. We need hearts that are shaped by a new story. We need hearts that are shaped by the true story that invites us into a new way of life. A story that starts with surrender to the God who made you and ends with freedom. Jesus invites all people, totally inclusive, all people. I will give you rest. If you're tired and burdened and carrying heavy things, I will give you rest. Come and walk with me. I will change you. I will change your affections. I will give you a new heart. Jesus also invites us to deny ourselves. Talk about an alternative story today, where culturally we just say, no, be yourself. More self-esteem, believe in yourself, be yourself. Self-actualize yourself. And Jesus comes and says, deny yourself. Why? Not because Jesus is just a bummer and he wants us to just live like this denial, self-denial. Why does he say that? Well, because it's only when we deny ourselves that we actually find our true self. It's only when we deny false stories and are exposed to the true story of reality of who he is and who he calls us to be, that we actually can experience self, how God intended. And so all throughout the Bible, we see teaching about a heart, right? You're my heart, that we need a new heart. Now, when it says heart, usually we throw hearts on Valentine's cards, and we talk about hearts as mainly just emotion, right? Like hearts are kind of like feels. That is true, but biblically, it's more than that too. Your heart is not just about emotions, it's about your core identity. Proverbs 27:19 says this, as water reflects the face of a man, so the heart of a man reflects the man. There's something about your heart that actually tells you who you are. Proverbs 4:23 commands us to guard or keep your heart, protect it above all else, for it determines the course of your life. Isn't that crazy? How we relate to our heart, how we form our identity, what stories we believe to tell us who we are actually will dictate what our life looks like. And that starts in the heart. James K.A. Smith, in his book, You Are What You Love, says this way, and I'll sum it up here, and we'll apply a couple things. He says, Jesus is a teacher who doesn't just inform our intellect, but he forms our very loves. He isn't content to simply deposit new ideas into your mind. He is after nothing less than your wants, your loves, and your longings. The gospel is not primarily about beliefs or behavior, but about becoming. And that starts in the heart. And it's a lifelong journey of being exposed to the alternative story that confronts the other stories that our heart is going to tell us. So here's what we want to do. I want to finish up and just kind of lean in for the last few minutes and look specifically, if this is true, for stories shaped and our emotions actually point to the stories that we believe, how in the world are we supposed to hear our emotions well? How should we engage our emotions? How should we hear them? How do we avoid emotions are everything and emotions are nothing and find a balanced point? Okay, 4 things on how to engage our emotions. Number 1, identify what you are feeling. Identify it. Okay, this is going to be very practical. Okay, and then we're going to land the plane together. This isn't just psycho babble, okay? Just stay with me. I know this is not normal. Reach Montreal people just like, I'm not used to words being there. I'm not used to Dustin having a list of 4 things. Dustin, are you okay? But I had to organize this somehow, all right? You're going to be happy that they don't start with the same letter like a good pastor, okay? Identify what you are feeling. What we don't want to do is silence or amplify our emotions before we actually hear what they're saying. Okay? We want to actually live life day to day, experience all of the full spectrum of our emotions, and hear them. And not just hear them, but name them. And be able to say, I am feeling blank. Here's what's going on. I'm hearing it. I'm experiencing it. Now, this is easier and harder for some. It is very hard for me. It is very easy for my wife. If my wife asks me, why are you so upset? You'd think that was an easy question. I'm usually pretty good at questions. That question is very hard for me to answer sometimes. I don't know why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. Sometimes I don't know what it is that I'm feeling. It's like anger, bad belly from pizza too late last night. I don't know. But a big part of this is for some of us, we're really good at this, and you don't need to listen to this, and that's fine. But for some of us, we don't even slow down to hear our feelings well because it's difficult. We don't stop and go, what is wrong? Why am I upset? What am I feeling? And you and I can only engage something and understand something that we know is there in the first place. So the first step of identifying what we're feeling is not being afraid of actually going there. Of actually going and being okay to say, I'm gonna just openly express this and I'm gonna feel it. We haven't made a judgment call yet as to whether it's a good emotion or a bad one yet. You haven't even decided what to do with that emotion yet. That's coming. But you have to slow down enough to actually identify what you're feeling. This is practiced all throughout the Bible. Throughout the Psalms, we see examples like the psalmist asking himself, why are you cast down, my soul or my heart? Why is there turmoil within me? Or another psalm, search me and know my heart, God. Test me and know my thoughts. Jonah, the prophet in the Old Testament, we did a series last year. when Jonah's outraged that Nineveh actually turns and doesn't just burn. Right? Jonah's like, turn or burn. And he hopes they burn, and they don't. They turn. And Jonah's there sulking. And God shows up and goes, do you have a right to be angry? You're angry right now. What is going on? Why are you angry? And he identifies what Jonah's feeling. Elijah, prophet in the Old Testament, after an intense conflict with Jezebel, he's depressed and suicidal. He literally is there in a state with God going, just end me. It would be better. And God lovingly asks, what led you to this place? How did you get here? There's something so important about the first step of emotional maturity being hearing well. Hearing our emotions well. Giving ourselves permission to feel them and then identify what it is that we're feeling. That's the first step. Jesus did it all the time. Jesus allows feelings. He allows himself to feel, and he expresses them. He doesn't make a judgment call off of whether they're good or bad. I shared the example of the Garden of Gethsemane on the eve of Jesus' crucifixion. And Jesus is going, I'm sorrowful to the point of death. He hasn't decided whether that emotion is going to lead him to change his decision making yet. He's just expressed the fact that that's how he's feeling. So for you who are good at this, amazing. You have to teach us who are not. For those of us who just kind of have silenced our emotions or don't even want to go down that route of feeling them, the first step to emotional maturity and emotional growth is to actually allow ourselves to feel and hear. Second, examine why you are feeling. Told you there was no alliteration. Identify what you are feeling, then examine why you are feeling. Okay? When you examine something, you study it. You take it out, you turn it around, you look at it, you get a full grasp of what's going on. Once you've identified, I am feeling this, I'm feeling anger, for instance. Then you got to take it and go, what is this emotion telling me? What am I reacting to? Why am I angry? What dominant story is lying behind this experience of anger? How is the feeling of anger motivating me to act and behave, whether it's good or bad? And we examine it, we study it, we turn it around, we kind of take it apart. This also is demonstrated throughout Scripture. Lamentations 3:40 says, let us examine our ways and return to the Lord. Meaning, there's a place for self-examination, not mindfulness, not turning inward to your inner self and actualizing who you are, not that. But self-examination so that, Lamentations says, we can return to the Lord. We look inwards so that we can turn outwards. We examine what's going on inside of us so we can look outside of us. And we can fully have this integration between what I'm experiencing on my inner world and what's happening in my outer world. That's what self-examination allows us to do. 2 Corinthians 13:5 applies it to faith and says, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Imagine that's what our church has preached in the West. Not like just because you came and said a prayer for 8 seconds, boom, heaven. But actually said, like, examine yourself to see whether you legitimately belong in the faith. Imagine the kind of like robust following of Jesus we would see happen in the church. Not just casual flirting with, well, I had an experience when I was 8. No, but examine yourself to see whether you're in the faith. Examine the dominant story of your life. Examine your sexuality and your value and your money and your possessions. Is it different? Examine it. Imagine what it could look like. An example is anger, I think here. The idea of examining. So, you're feeling angry, okay? Sometimes you just are, right? Anyone? Just like, I'm angry right now. I'm angry today. Matthew. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Okay, I'm angry. I'm feeling angry. I don't know why. I haven't even figured that out. I haven't started to examine it. But now I'm going to examine it. So then I go and I start examining the fact that I actually feel angry. And I realize that as I trace it out and as I kind of track back, it's because something my spouse or my friend said earlier that day that actually hurt me. And I was hurt, and later in the day I hadn't dealt with it, so that hurt has turned into anger. And what that causes me to do throughout the rest of the day is that I actually withdraw. I start to pull back from conversations with coworkers and friends. I start to pull back and disengage a little bit in a healthy way from others throughout the day. Whereas normally I would smile at the person at the bus stop, I don't because my earphones are in and you're a stranger anyway. And my anger has started to now just seep out throughout the day. Later that day, I have some time. I have dinner with some friends that are coming up. Not the same friend, but I have dinner with the friend. I cancel it because I just feel so about how I was hurt earlier by what was said. Then I start thinking about how I'm going to respond to this. And I start thinking what I'm going to say back in retaliation. And I start telling myself a story. And I start telling myself a story about when I see them next. Oh, you know what? I'm going to text them. And the emoji that I'm going to use, right? And you start telling yourself a story. You start telling yourself a story, and the emotion is driving this entire thing. And what you haven't done yet is you haven't slowed down and examined the emotion. Because as you start to examine it, everything starts to change. Rather than just go, I'm hurt, I'm angry, you start to go, now I've known this person for this many years. Would they say something that intentionally hurt me? Have I known them to be like that? Did they say that to hurt me and that's why I'm angry? Or did they say it and totally not even realize that it hurt me because I haven't even told them yet? And then you start to tease it out a little bit and you start to examine your emotions. Now, how different would your reaction be the next time you speak with them? Very different. You wouldn't be looking to retaliate and say something back just to jab at them and hurt them. But you'd be looking for an opportunity to express to them that actually what they said earlier, even though they didn't mean it and you know that because they're for you, it hurt you. And you're actually angry for half a day about it. And you canceled an event because of it. Do you see what kind of transparency that offers into a relationship? You see what kind of honesty? Now, in that whole scenario, there were false stories competing with the true story. And the false stories really drove us to make decisions that ultimately will just lead to more hurt and just kind of this snowball of emotional dysfunction between you and whoever else you're relating to. This is why it's so important to examine our emotions. Examining our emotions is the only way that we can hear what they're saying, identify what they are, and then as we start to examine them, we start to understand how now we can act and respond. The third step before we act is to evaluate the good and bad of what you're feeling. Okay? Rarely, almost never, are emotions only good or bad. Okay? Anger, again, good example, can come from something like that. It's like, well, I was angry, I was hurt, I examined it, I figured out, and it led me to act good because I thought it through, I evaluated it, and then I responded to that friend who hurt me, and I was able to express the fact that I was angry and why. But anger also can lead me to do the exact opposite, right? Forget them, delete, unfriend, block their number, never going to coffee again. Right? So emotions aren't kind of like neutral things. Even bad ones can actually do the right thing. Good emotions can actually be bad. Sometimes you feel really good about the wrong thing. You fall into an addictive behavior and you feel good about following through on that addiction. It's a bad feeling, even though it feels good. So emotions aren't just kind of neutral things. So often there's good and bad in every single one of our emotions. And it's really important to evaluate them and start to tease out of them, pull out of them what is the good and what is the bad that comes out of that as I evaluate it. And fourth and finally, you act. Then you act. Now, okay, this sounds exhausting, doesn't it? Isn't it better just to live life as a gigantic heart with legs and then just feel everywhere you go and then just act how you feel? Doesn't that sound way easier? It is in the moment because you don't have to do any of this garbage. But ultimately it leads to way more pain. It leads to the breakdown of relationships. It leads to the disconnect between who you are and who God is. And so it's so important to go through this process before we act. Now, are you going to nail it all the time? Of course not. Of course not. Sometimes you're just going to jump to feel and act. But as we grow in our emotional maturity, as we understand, as we identify the emotions, as we look at why we are feeling them and we examine them and then we evaluate them, we get to the point where then we can act accordingly. We can respond well. Once you identify what you're feeling, why you're feeling that, and you've evaluated the good and bad of that emotion, now you're ready to act. And what a new heart does, it allows us to align our deepest desires with our strongest desires. Our deepest desires with our strongest desires. If you're a follower of Jesus and you've been changed by the gospel and who Christ is, and you're living life for him, your deepest desire in every given moment is to live life for him. You with me on that? But then sometimes your strongest desire in the moment is to act like a clown. It's to make terrible decisions. It's to have that person cut you off and you do sign language at them as you drive by. Okay, you know the sign language, right? Okay, that's your strongest desire in the moment is just like, oh yeah. But your deepest desire as a follower of Jesus is not to respond like that at all. This kind of process allows us to align our deepest desire and our strongest desire. And what's really crazy about that, when you understand this and you go back into the Gospels and you start looking at Jesus, Jesus has desires that in the moment are his strongest desires. His strongest desire in the Garden of Gethsemane is for God to figure out another way to do this whole salvation thing. It's like, can you find another way? Is there a plan B? Because that would be great right now. His strongest desire is to get out of it and not go through what he's about to go through. But his deepest desire is what? Your will be done. His deepest desire is for God's will to be done. His deepest desire is to not have self-centered feelings and subjectivity drive the objective reality that this is a God who is going to save humanity through the work of his son, Jesus Christ. That's his deepest desire. And so this kind of process allows us to take our strongest desires and emotions and align them with our deepest desires and say, God, let your will be done. Once we go through this 4-step process, my book will come out later this year. Just kidding, it's not. I'm not writing a book on this. I'd be the least qualified person to write a book on it. After we've kind of done this and gone through this 4-step process, notice what I missed from the list altogether. Who did I leave out of the equation? Come on, Sunday school answer. You can give it to me. Jesus. Okay, great answer. Okay, I didn't even show you, like, when do we actually engage God in this? Like, when do we bring God into that? Like, how do we figure that out? And I left that out on purpose. Why? Because engaging our emotions is actually a way that we can engage God. Engaging our emotions is not a step. Engaging God with our emotions is not a step in the process. It's the goal of the entire thing. And that there's something so true about the more that we kind of anchor and understand who we are, that we will see who God is. St. Augustine has a great prayer from the 4th century where he says, God, allow myself to know me so that I will know thee. So there's something about actually plumbing the depths of who you are and engaging your emotions well that God promises to reveal himself through that. Is it any wonder that in our culture of emotions being everything or emotions being nothing, that we have left God out of the equation altogether? So this process is a way for us to engage God and involve him in every single step of the way because he's not afraid of it. Psalm 62:8 says, trust in him, in God at all times, and pour out your heart before him because God is a refuge for us. Jesus does this over and over and over again. He is brutally transparent. And he doesn't just engage his emotions, because we can do that without God, right? We can just kind of, what am I feeling? Self-actualization, put my mindfulness app on, go walk my dog, talk to him like he's a person, give him organic dog food, and then go home. That was a short criticism of organic dog food, sorry. But we could do that without God even being a part of the equation. But what Jesus does constantly is he engages his emotions, and then he immediately engages God. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he feels the emotions, he engages them, he identifies what he's going through, and then what does he do? He goes and he prays. He goes and he actually brings them right before God. He pours out his heart before God. And here's where I want to land. Here's how I want to close. If you do not bring your emotions to God, you will bring your emotions to someone or something else. You can't help yourself. They will leak. You and I and our brokenness, emotionally and relationally, our emotions will leak. You will bring them to someone. You will bring them to something. if you do not bring them to God. And so for us, for those of you who do know Jesus and trust Jesus and follow Jesus, some of you haven't even considered this. It's like, no, I can't go to God with this. I got to clean up first. I can't tell him that's how I feel. He's going to be so angry. Lightning bolts, whatever other story you've told yourself. The gospel comes in and actually shows us that to be truly human is to engage our emotions and to engage God in the full spectrum of everything that we experience day to day. Isn't that amazing that we have the freedom to do that? That we have the invitation to engage our emotions, all of them, and engage God with them. Smith and Groves wrote a book called Untangling Emotions. I'm going to leave you with this, okay? Because it's extremely profound, and we're going to tease this out for the rest of the series, but listen to this. The only reason we ever fail to dash toward God with any of our emotions is that we aren't completely convinced it is worth it. The most common reason we escort our emotions elsewhere is that it never occurs to us to take them to God. We don't trust him with our emotions because he seems either irrelevant or we assume that we ought to get our act together before going to him. If you and I are able to tell ourselves a different story, the true story about how to engage our emotions and how to engage God, we won't struggle with this at all because we're not performing anymore. You with me on that? Like, it's not a performance. We don't have to clean up our emotions or get rid of the bad ones before we bring them to him. That we actually can go to him raw and fully expressive, fully emotional, and bring them to him. So let me ask, what's your tendency? Do you usually engage your emotions only? Or do you also engage God in that process? Some of you engage God only and you ignore what you're feeling. You kind of just silence your emotions like, me and you, Lord. But you're not honest. You're living hypocritical. You're putting on a mask when you come to God. What part of this process do you struggle with the most? Like hearing what you're feeling, identifying it, evaluating it, and acting. What part of that do you struggle with the most? What makes it hard maybe for you to bring your emotions to God? What are the stories underlying that and why you don't bring your emotions to God? So here's how I want to close, and I just want to apply this quickly. And we're going to do a lot more of this week in our city groups. But before we kind of move past this and take this as like, well, that was helpful, I want us to actually engage well now. I want us to take a minute. We're just going to engage our emotions. If the band can make their way up, we're just going to take a minute. Here's what I want us to do. I want you to take the strongest emotion that you experienced this week, whatever it was. Maybe it was just jubilance. Do you guys use jubilance? It's a good word. We should bring it back. What was the strongest emotion you saw come out of yourself this week? And I want you to engage it. Okay, as we close, we're just going to engage. I know this is like a little different for us. Like, well, this seems very contemplative. Okay? But we're going to do this together. We're just going to engage it well. Go through this process, examine it, pull it apart. And then I want you to get to the end of that process and I want you to bring it to God. I want this to just be a moment where we can pause and really just end our time in prayer.